The night in ancient Greece did not fall as a sudden curtain, but as a slow surrender of light, a gradual fading that seemed almost deliberate, as if the sky itself were reluctant to abandon the day. In that long, dimming hour, before oil lamps were lit and before hearth fires became the center of every household, stories traveled more easily than shadows. Voices carried across courtyards, over low stone walls, through narrow streets worn smooth by generations of sandals. Greek mythology was not originally a written tradition. It lived first in breath and memory. It belonged to people who did not sit silently with books, but listened with half-closed eyes while someone older, often someone tired from work in the fields or workshops, spoke of gods whose lives felt strangely familiar. These stories were not delivered with dramatic urgency, but with a steady, almost calming rhythm. The world of Olympus did not exist as distant fantasy. It was woven into the same fabric as wind, harvest, illness, and the slow passing of seasons. To understand Greek mythology as a history suitable for quiet listening, it helps to imagine not the temples or statues that survive today, but the ordinary evening moments in which these tales were shared. A farmer might describe Zeus not as a towering marble figure, but as the reason thunder interrupted the night's silence. A mother might mention Demeter when explaining why grain must be stored carefully before winter. Mythology functioned less as entertainment and more as explanation layered with comfort. The gods argued, made mistakes, forgave, punished, and occasionally helped. They were unpredictable, but their presence gave shape to events that might otherwise have felt random and frightening. Long before written collections such as Hesiod's Theogony organized divine genealogies into something resembling order, Greek communities held overlapping versions of the same stories. There was no single official narrative of creation. In some tellings, existence began with chaos, not chaos in the modern sense of disorder, but a vast, open emptiness. From this emptiness emerged Gaia, the earth, a stable and enduring presence. Gaia was not imagined as an abstract concept, but as something tangible beneath one's feet. To step outside at night, feel cool soil, and look upward at the sky was to stand literally between primordial forces. Gaia's emergence was followed by Uranus, the sky, who stretched over her like an endless dome. Their union produced the Titans, beings neither fully divine in the later Olympian sense, nor entirely separate from the natural world. These early generations of gods were not distant rulers living in palaces above clouds. They represented fundamental aspects of existence: oceans, memory, time, light. The mythic genealogy reads less like a family tree and more like an attempt to map reality itself. Among the Titans, Cronus became a figure both powerful and uneasy. His story, often told in measured tones rather than dramatic exaggeration, carried an undercurrent of inevitability. Cronus overthrew his father Uranus, establishing a pattern that would echo through later myths, succession achieved through conflict. Yet his victory did not bring peace. A prophecy warned that one of his own children would eventually overthrow him as well. This anxiety shaped his behavior in a way that ancient listeners likely understood on a human level. Fear of losing power is not limited to gods. The image of Cronus swallowing each newborn child might seem grotesque when read quickly, but when described slowly, it becomes less a spectacle and more a symbol of time consuming what it produces. Each child, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, disappeared into him until only Zeus remained hidden. Rhea, their mother, concealed Zeus by presenting Cronus with a wrapped stone. The deception was simple, almost domestic in scale: a blanket, a cradle, a substitution made in desperation. Zeus grew not in a palace but in secrecy, raised on the island of Crete. The environment of his upbringing, often described with quiet pastoral detail, contrasts sharply with the tension of his father's rule. Goats provided milk. Attendants shielded his cries so they would not be heard. This imagery reflects how myths often locate decisive moments in humble settings. The future ruler of the sky began life as a hidden child in a cave. When Zeus reached maturity, the conflict that followed was not a sudden burst of violence, but a prolonged struggle remembered as the Titanomachy. The war between Titans and Olympians lasted years in mythic time, suggesting not a single battle, but a drawn-out shift in cosmic authority. Mountains were described as shaking, and the sea churned, but these descriptions functioned as poetic ways to express change rather than literal battlefield reports. Zeus eventually compelled Cronus to release his swallowed siblings. Once freed, they formed alliances that would define the structure of the Olympian order. Hestia became associated with the hearth, representing stability within every home. Demeter governed agriculture, ensuring that human survival remained linked to divine favor. Hera assumed the role of queen, embodying both marriage and the complexities that accompany it. Poseidon took dominion over the sea, a realm both vital and unpredictable for coastal communities. Hades, rather than ruling among the living, became sovereign of the underworld. The division of realms among the brothers, sky for Zeus, sea for Poseidon, Hades for the underworld, reflects a desire to categorize existence into manageable domains. Ancient listeners did not imagine constant chaos among the gods, but rather an uneasy balance. Each deity had responsibilities. Even conflicts followed recognizable patterns. Mount Olympus itself was not described with excessive ornamentation in early tradition. It was a high, distant place, often obscured by cloud. Its significance lay not in architecture, but in elevation. Height created separation without complete isolation. The gods could observe human activity while remaining physically beyond reach. Despite their authority, Olympian gods were rarely portrayed as morally perfect. Zeus, though powerful, was frequently distracted by personal desires. Hera, though dignified, could be intensely jealous. Poseidon's temperament shifted like the sea he governed. These characteristics made the divine world feel less abstract and more relatable. Mythology did not attempt to present flawless beings, but rather magnified familiar human traits onto a larger scale. The relationship between gods and mortals was neither consistently benevolent nor entirely hostile. Offerings at temples were acts of acknowledgement rather than guarantees of protection. A successful harvest might be interpreted as divine favor, while drought could be seen as neglect or punishment. This reciprocal understanding shaped daily rituals: small libations of wine, a portion of bread set aside, a whispered request before travel, all functioned as quiet negotiations with unseen forces. Among the most enduring myths is that of Demeter and her daughter Persephone. Unlike the cosmic conflicts of earlier generations, this story unfolds with emotional intimacy. Persephone's abduction by Hades was not framed solely as an act of conquest, but as an event with seasonal consequences. Demeter's grief caused crops to fail, fields lay dormant, humanity faced hunger. The eventual agreement allowing Persephone to spend part of each year above ground introduced a cyclical explanation for changing seasons. Winter was not random, but a period of separation. Spring represented reunion. This myth carried practical implications for agricultural societies while also offering a narrative that made loss and return part of a predictable rhythm. Greek mythology also preserved stories of gods interacting directly with individuals whose names would otherwise have vanished. Prometheus, a titan who sided with humanity, became associated with the gift of fire. His decision to provide humans with this transformative resource was remembered as both heroic and defiant. Zeus's punishment, binding Prometheus to a rock where an eagle consumed his liver daily, illustrated consequences that extended beyond simple retribution. The liver's nightly regeneration created an image of ongoing endurance rather than final defeat. Fire itself symbolized more than warmth or cooking. It represented technology, craft, and the ability to reshape environment. The myth acknowledged that advancement often carries risk and tension with established authority. Hephaestus, the god of craftsmanship, occupied a unique position among Olympians. Unlike the physically idealized deities often depicted in sculpture, he was associated with imperfection. Lame in some accounts, he worked at a forge rather than presiding over grand assemblies. His presence suggested that skill and creativity held divine significance equal to beauty or strength. Tools, armor, and intricate objects attributed to his workshop emphasized the importance of labor. Athena, born fully formed from Zeus's head, represented wisdom combined with strategic thinking. Her origin story, though unusual, reinforced her association with intellect rather than inheritance. Cities, particularly Athens, considered her a patron who valued planning over impulse. The famous contest between Athena and Poseidon for control of Athens, olive tree versus saltwater spring, highlighted practical benefits over dramatic displays. Apollo and Artemis, twins associated with light and wilderness respectively, balanced each other's domains. Apollo's connection to music, prophecy, and healing reflected the structured side of culture. Artemis's guardianship of forests and animals acknowledged the persistence of untamed landscapes beyond city walls. Their coexistence within the same divine family illustrated how Greek mythology rarely framed opposites as enemies. Hermes moved between worlds more freely than most gods. Messenger, guide of souls, patron of travelers and merchants, he embodied transition. Roads, crossroads, and thresholds were spaces of uncertainty, and Hermes' presence there provided reassurance that movement itself had divine oversight. Dionysus introduced another dimension to the pantheon, representing ecstasy, transformation, and the temporary suspension of ordinary constraints. His festivals involved music, dance, and altered states that allowed participants to step outside daily routines. While some myths portray these experiences as dangerous when uncontrolled, they also acknowledge a human need for release. Mortals who interacted with gods often found themselves changed permanently. The story of Arachne, who challenged Athena in weaving, serves as a quiet warning about pride. Her transformation into a spider preserved her skill while altering her form. Similarly, the tale of King Midas, whose wish for everything he touched to become gold eventually threatened his survival, illustrates how desire without foresight can become burden. Heroes occupied a space between divine and human experience. Heracles, known for immense strength, was also defined by the necessity of completing difficult labors. These tasks, slaying creatures, capturing elusive animals, cleaning neglected spaces, often involved persistence more than spectacle. His narrative suggests that redemption is achieved through effort extended over time. Odysseus, unlike Heracles, relied primarily on cunning. His long journey home after the Trojan War emphasized patience, adaptability, and endurance. Encounters with beings such as the Cyclops or the enchantress Circe were less about combat and more about negotiation or deception. The pacing of his travels, stretched across years, mirrors the slow unfolding typical of oral storytelling traditions. The Trojan War itself occupies a central position in Greek mythic memory, not because of precise historical. Oracles, particularly at Delphi, provided another channel through which mythology influenced daily life. Individuals and city leaders alike sought guidance interpreted through poetic language. Responses were often ambiguous, requiring reflection rather than blind acceptance. The process reinforced the idea that knowledge, even when divinely sourced, required human interpretation. Over time, poets such as Homer and Hesiod recorded versions of these narratives, preserving them in written form while also shaping their structure. Their works did not create mythology, but organized existing traditions into sequences that could be transmitted across generations. Even then, variation persisted. Different regions maintained alternative details without viewing contradiction as a problem. Greek mythology's endurance owes much to its flexibility. Stories were not fixed monuments, but living frameworks capable of absorbing new perspectives. Philosophers later re-examined myths allegorically, suggesting that gods represented forces within the human psyche or natural processes rather than literal beings residing on a mountain. Despite these reinterpretations, the older narrative rhythm, measured, descriptive, attentive to environment, continued to influence how the myths were retold. The pacing invites listeners to imagine landscapes slowly, olive groves under fading light, distant hills turning purple at dusk, the steady sound of waves against rock. In quiet retellings suited for rest, the emphasis shifts away from dramatic conflict toward continuity. The same gods who once overthrew predecessors eventually became part of a stable cosmic arrangement. Their stories, repeated across centuries, created a shared cultural memory that outlasted political change. Even as Greek city-states rose and fell, the mythology persisted because it did not depend on a single authority. Anyone who remembered a tale could pass it forward. A shepherd watching stars emerge might recount Orion's placement among them. A sailor navigating by constellations might recall the transformation of Callisto into the Great Bear. The night sky itself became an extension of mythic geography. Patterns of stars were not random points, but reminders of narratives anchored in collective imagination. This connection between observation and story allowed mythology to accompany individuals wherever they traveled. As centuries progressed, contact with other cultures introduced new interpretations. Roman adoption of Greek gods under different names demonstrated how adaptable the underlying narratives were. Zeus became Jupiter, Hera became Juno, yet their essential characteristics remained recognizable. What remains most striking when approached slowly is how Greek mythology never fully separates the extraordinary from the ordinary. Divine actions influence rainfall, harvest cycles, craftsmanship, music, and navigation. The myths do not ask listeners to abandon daily concerns, but instead provide a framework that includes them. Listening to these stories in a calm setting reveals their original function as companions to routine rather than interruptions. They filled evenings when work had ended but sleep had not yet arrived. Their measured cadence, rich in description but rarely rushed, allowed attention to drift without losing the thread entirely. In that sense, Greek mythology was never solely about gods. It was about people trying to understand why storms arrived without warning, why seasons changed, why skill varied from one artisan to another. The narratives offered explanations that were less about certainty and more about connection. As the imagined night deepens across ancient Greece, one can picture scattered lights from oil lamps flickering behind clay walls. Somewhere, a voice continues recounting how Hermes guided travelers safely, or how Athena favored careful planning. The listener, perhaps reclining after a long day, does not need every detail to remain awake. The story's familiarity provides comfort. If one were to wander through an ancient Greek settlement long after the final glow of sunset had faded, the silence would not feel empty, but gently occupied by memory. The stones beneath each step would carry impressions left by generations who had walked the same paths while thinking about the same gods. Mythology did not exist in isolated tales that began and ended neatly. It moved through daily routines like a current beneath the surface of ordinary life. A baker kneading dough before dawn might murmur a small acknowledgement to Hestia, not out of theatrical devotion, but because the fire in the oven represented continuity between human effort and divine stability. In that quiet exchange between action and belief, mythology was less about spectacle and more about a sense that existence itself was structured by relationships both visible and unseen. The Greeks rarely treated their myths as distant legends belonging exclusively to the past. Instead, the stories occupied a present tense that stretched across centuries. A sudden storm at sea was not merely weather, but a sign that Poseidon's mood had shifted, perhaps irritated by neglect, or simply acting according to his own unknowable temperament. Sailors did not imagine they could control him, only that they might show respect through offerings cast into the water before departure. These gestures were often small, wine poured from a cup, a whispered promise, but they reflected a worldview in which divine attention could be invited without ever being guaranteed. Among the more quietly influential figures within the mythic landscape was Hestia, whose presence was rarely associated with dramatic narratives, yet remained constant in nearly every household. The hearth, positioned at the center of domestic space, functioned as both a practical necessity and a symbolic anchor. Fire had to be maintained carefully, neither allowed to die nor permitted to spread uncontrollably. This balance mirrored the Greek preference for moderation in many aspects of life. Hestia's domain was not conquest or transformation, but steadiness. Her mythological significance emerges not through conflict, but through continuity, suggesting that stability itself was worthy of reverence. In contrast, the figure of Ares embodied the disruptive force of conflict without necessarily providing resolution. Unlike Athena, whose strategic intelligence was often portrayed as measured and purposeful, Ares represented the raw surge of battle's chaos. Ancient audiences did not always celebrate him. In some regions, he was respected cautiously rather than adored. His presence within mythology acknowledged that violence existed as an undeniable part of human experience, yet it also distinguished between uncontrolled aggression and disciplined defense. By maintaining both Ares and Athena within the same divine family, Greek myth allowed space for reflection on how similar energies could produce vastly different outcomes. Athena's influence extended beyond warfare into craftsmanship, governance, and rational problem-solving. Her association with weaving was particularly telling. The act of creating patterned cloth required patience, foresight, and the ability to maintain tension across threads without breaking them. This process served as a metaphor for civic life, in which communities depended on the careful interlacing of individual roles. When myths described Athena guiding heroes or advising city leaders, the emphasis often rested on planning rather than immediate action. Her wisdom was not portrayed as abstract knowledge, but as practical insight applied to real situations. The mythic city of Athens itself became inseparable from Athena's identity. The olive tree she provided during her contest with Poseidon was valued not only for its fruit, but for its oil, which illuminated lamps, preserved food, and served as a trade commodity. The choice between salt water and a sustainable resource reflected a cultural appreciation for long-term benefit over short-term spectacle. In this way, mythology encoded economic realities within narrative form, allowing listeners to internalize values through story rather than instruction. Beyond the structured environments of cities lay landscapes that mythology treated with equal attention. Mountains, forests, and springs were rarely considered empty spaces. They were inhabited by nymphs, minor deities whose presence explained the individuality of each location. A particular grove might be associated with a dryad whose well-being depended on the survival of the tree she inhabited. Travelers passing through such areas often behaved with quiet caution, recognizing that careless damage could be interpreted as an offense against unseen guardians. This belief system encouraged a form of environmental respect long before the concept existed as a formal philosophy. Water sources, especially springs, carried their own mythic associations. Fresh water emerging from rock was both practical and mysterious. Naiads were imagined as gentle presences within these flows, sustaining life without demanding elaborate rituals. The consistent availability of water, so critical in Mediterranean climates, became linked. The boundary between divine and mortal realms remained permeable, particularly in stories involving transformation. Metamorphosis did not always function as punishment. Sometimes it preserved memory or protected individuals from harm. The tale of Daphne, who became a laurel tree while fleeing Apollo, carries a sense of stillness rather than tragedy when recounted slowly. The resulting tree retained her presence in a form that could endure without fear. Laurel leaves later crowned poets and victors, embedding her story into cultural rituals that extended far beyond its original telling. Similarly, the constellation myths served as a bridge between earthly experience and celestial observation. Orion's placement among the stars transformed a hunter into a permanent guide for navigation. Ancient viewers did not see random arrangements, but recognizable figures whose stories unfolded across the night sky. This practice turned astronomy into a narrative activity. Watching stars rise and set became a continuation of mythic remembrance, allowing individuals to participate in storytelling simply by looking upward. Music and poetry played central roles in maintaining these traditions. The Muses, daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne, represented different forms of creative expression. Their mother's association with memory emphasized that art depended on the preservation of knowledge across time. When a poet invoked the Muses before recitation, the gesture acknowledged that storytelling was not purely individual, but part of a collective heritage. The cadence of spoken verse, often steady and repetitive in structure, though varied in content, made long narratives easier to retain. Apollo's connection to music reinforced the idea that harmony extended beyond sound into broader patterns of order. His lyre symbolized balance between tension and release, much like the rhythms found in daily life. Healing, prophecy, and artistic inspiration all fell within his influence, suggesting that clarity, whether physical, intellectual, or emotional, was interconnected. The sanctuary at Delphi, where Apollo's oracle delivered enigmatic guidance, became a focal point for individuals seeking direction during uncertain times. Consultation at Delphi was rarely straightforward. Responses arrived through layered language open to interpretation. This ambiguity did not undermine belief, but instead encouraged reflection. Leaders who acted on oracular advice often had to weigh multiple possible meanings, acknowledging that certainty was elusive even when divine insight was requested. The process reinforced a cultural acceptance of complexity, where outcomes depended as much on human judgment as on supernatural message. Within domestic settings, mythology continued to function quietly. Children learned stories not through formal education alone, but through repetition during everyday activities. A grandmother spinning wool might recount how Penelope maintained her household through patience and clever delay while awaiting Odysseus's return. The image of weaving and unweaving a shroud each night served as both narrative device and practical demonstration of resourcefulness under pressure. Such stories reinforced behavioral expectations without explicit instruction. Odysseus's prolonged journey resonated particularly with communities familiar with travel's unpredictability. His encounters were rarely defined solely by physical danger. Instead, they required adaptability. When facing the Cyclops, brute force proved less effective than strategic deception. When detained by Calypso, endurance rather than aggression determined eventual escape. The pacing of his narrative, extending across years of wandering, mirrored the slow rhythms of real voyages undertaken by traders and sailors across the Mediterranean. Not all mythic journeys involved heroic struggle. Some described transitions that were inevitable rather than chosen. The passage of souls to the underworld, guided by Hermes, presented death as movement rather than abrupt disappearance. The river Styx, the ferryman Charon, and the fields beyond created a geography that allowed the living to imagine continuity beyond physical life. While the underworld was not portrayed as a place of universal joy, it was structured, governed, and therefore comprehensible within the mythic framework. Hades himself, often misunderstood as malevolent, functioned primarily as a custodian of balance. His role required maintaining boundaries between living and dead rather than seeking domination. The relative absence of elaborate temples dedicated to him suggests that reverence was expressed through acknowledgement rather than celebration. Myths involving journeys into his realm, such as Orpheus's attempt to retrieve Eurydice, emphasized the difficulty of reversing natural processes once initiated. Orpheus's story, when told with unhurried emphasis, becomes less about failure and more about the fragile nature of trust. His music persuaded the guardians of the underworld to allow Eurydice's return under a single condition: he must not look back until reaching the surface. The eventual glance, driven by doubt, illustrates how uncertainty can undermine even the most extraordinary opportunity. The narrative's emotional weight lies in its quiet inevitability rather than dramatic punishment. Festivals provided structured opportunities for communities to engage collectively with these mythic themes. The Panathenaea in Athens honored Athena through processions, athletic contests, and artistic presentations. Participants did not merely observe, they reenacted aspects of shared identity rooted in divine patronage. Similarly, Dionysian festivals created temporary spaces where ordinary hierarchies softened. Theater emerged from these celebrations, allowing myths to be explored through performance rather than recitation alone. Greek tragedy and comedy both drew heavily on mythological material, yet their pacing often remained measured enough to invite contemplation. Audiences were familiar with the general outcomes of stories such as those involving Oedipus or Agamemnon. The dramatic tension arose not from surprise, but from witnessing how characters moved toward known destinies. This familiarity transformed performances into communal reflection rather than suspenseful entertainment. The persistence of myth through artistic mediums ensured that even as political structures changed, narrative continuity remained. Sculptors captured moments of transformation in marble, freezing dynamic stories into still form. Vase painters illustrated episodes that viewers could recognize instantly, reinforcing memory through visual repetition. These objects were not merely decorative, they functioned as portable reminders of shared cultural knowledge. Trade networks carried these images and stories beyond their original regions. As Greek colonies spread across the Mediterranean, local adaptations emerged. A deity associated primarily with one function in mainland Greece might acquire additional attributes in a coastal settlement where environmental conditions differed. This flexibility prevented mythology from becoming rigid. Instead, it evolved gradually, absorbing influences without losing recognizable structure. Philosophers later approached myths with analytical distance, questioning literal interpretations while preserving symbolic significance. Some suggested that the gods represented elemental forces or psychological archetypes. Others viewed mythic narratives as early attempts at explaining natural phenomena before systematic science developed. Yet even among skeptical thinkers, the stories retained value as cultural memory and ethical exploration. Education in classical Greece often included exposure to mythic poetry, not solely for religious instruction but for linguistic and rhetorical training. Students memorized passages, absorbing both language patterns and narrative content simultaneously. This practice ensured that mythology remained embedded within intellectual life as well as popular tradition. As centuries passed and external influences increased, the mythological framework continued to provide continuity. Under Roman administration, many Greek deities were integrated into a broader imperial pantheon. Names changed. Zeus became Jupiter, Aphrodite became Venus, but underlying characteristics persisted. Temples were rededicated rather than abandoned, allowing local populations to maintain familiar forms of reverence within new political realities. Aphrodite's own narratives illustrate how mythology addressed themes of attraction, desire, and consequence without reducing them to simple moral lessons. Her influence extended across both divine and mortal relationships, often initiating events that unfolded unpredictably. The judgment of Paris, which eventually contributed to the Trojan War, began as a dispute over beauty. This origin emphasizes how seemingly minor decisions can ripple outward into large-scale outcomes. The Trojan War cycle itself became a vast narrative network encompassing numerous perspectives. While heroic combat occupied part of the tradition, quieter moments, conversations with intents, reflections before battle, acts of mourning provided emotional depth. The fall of Troy, achieved through the stratagem of the wooden horse, reinforced the recurring motif that ingenuity can alter the course of events more effectively than prolonged force. After the war, returning heroes faced challenges that extended beyond physical survival. Agamemnon's homecoming ended in betrayal, highlighting how victory abroad did not guarantee stability at home. These post-war narratives acknowledged that consequences of conflict persist long after battles conclude. Mythology thus functioned as a space where communities could process experiences of loss and transition. Throughout all these stories, time itself operated differently than in historical chronologies. Mythic events were not fixed to precise dates, but existed within a layered sense of once, allowing them to remain perpetually relevant. This timelessness contributed to their suitability for evening recitation, where listeners could drift between awareness and imagination without needing to track exact sequences. As the imagined night deepens again, the presence of mythology feels less like a collection of dramatic episodes and more like an extended landscape stretching across memory. Each deity, hero, and transformed figure occupies a place within that terrain, available to be revisited whenever a story is told. The steady cadence of narration, the familiarity of recurring names, and the gentle progression from one tale to another create an atmosphere conducive to rest rather than excitement. There were nights in the ancient Aegean world when the sea became so calm that even the smallest rowing boat seemed to float inside a sheet of dark glass. In those hours, when the shoreline lost its sharp outline and distant hills merged into shadow, sailors did not speak loudly. They listened instead, to water tapping gently against wood, to the creak of rope, and to the quiet expectation that unseen presences occupied the same horizon. Greek mythology did not begin as a collection of heroic clashes or grand declarations. It grew from moments like these, where uncertainty encouraged imagination to provide structure. A smooth sea might be interpreted as a sign that Poseidon was resting, neither angered nor actively watching. The absence of disturbance itself became meaningful. For people who depended on travel across unpredictable waters, stories about divine temperament served practical psychological purpose. A voyage that ended safely could be attributed to proper respect shown before departure, reinforcing ritual behavior. Offerings were rarely extravagant. A cup of diluted wine poured into the waves, or a small figurine left at a coastal shrine functioned as acknowledgement rather than payment. The gods were not merchants exchanging services, but powerful neighbors whose goodwill mattered even when it could not be measured directly. Along these same coasts, fishermen often rose before dawn, navigating by memory and faint starlight. The constellations they followed were not anonymous patterns, but familiar figures whose narratives had been repeated so frequently that orientation in the sky became a form of storytelling.
The slow rotation of Orion across the winter horizon was more than seasonal change. It marked the presence of a hunter whose myth persisted beyond mortality. By tracking these celestial forms, sailors participated in an ongoing relationship between observation and inherited narrative. Inland, far from salt air and tidal rhythms, agricultural communities experienced mythology through different cycles. The soil's responsiveness to rain or drought shaped how divine influence was perceived. Farmers preparing fields in early spring might recall not only Demeter's authority over grain, but also the fragile negotiations embedded in her myth with Persephone's periodic absence. The return of green shoots was not taken for granted. It was interpreted as confirmation that separation had once again given way to reunion. This interpretation transformed the first visible growth into a moment layered with both relief and gratitude.
The cultivation of vines added another dimension to seasonal awareness. Grapevines required patience across multiple years before yielding reliable harvests. Dionysus, associated with wine and altered perception, represented both the reward of successful cultivation and the unpredictable effects of its consumption. His presence in myth acknowledged that joy could arise from transformation, yet it also warned that imbalance carried consequences. Festivals honoring him were structured carefully, allowing participants to experience release without entirely abandoning social cohesion. Within the domestic sphere, mythological awareness often manifested through routine gestures that were so habitual they scarcely required conscious thought. Before a meal began, a small portion might be set aside. This act did not demand elaborate explanation. It was simply understood as recognition that sustenance was never solely the result of human effort. Grain had grown, animals had been raised, weather had cooperated. Each step perceived as part of a broader network of influences that extended beyond individual control. Children growing up within such environments learned the names of gods in the same way they learned the names of relatives. The distinction between divine and human presence was clear, yet both occupied the same conversational space. Stories were rarely presented as distant mythology in the modern sense. Instead, they were recounted as inherited knowledge explaining why certain customs existed. A young listener might hear about Hermes not through a formal lesson, but during a journey along a dusty road, when an elder pointed to a stone marker and mentioned that travelers once left tokens there for safe passage. Hermes himself represented movement more than destination. His role as messenger, guide, and patron of exchange linked him to thresholds where transitions occurred. Markets, crossroads, and harbor entrances were all spaces where uncertainty lingered. By associating these locations with a deity who embodied adaptability, mythology offered reassurance that change did not happen without oversight. Even the passage of souls after death was framed as a guided journey rather than a solitary drift into absence. The underworld, as imagined in Greek tradition, contained structure rather than chaos. Rivers, fields, and regions designated for different kinds of spirits created a geography that mirrored the organization of the living world. The presence of judges who evaluated past actions suggested that existence retained coherence beyond physical life. Although not depicted as uniformly pleasant, this realm was not portrayed as meaningless. It functioned as continuation under different conditions. Narratives involving temporary visits to this domain emphasized the difficulty of reversing natural processes. When heroes attempted retrievals, success depended on adherence to strict conditions. The repeated motif of nearly achieved return, followed by irreversible loss, underscored the fragility of opportunity. These stories did not rely on sudden violence, but on quiet moments of hesitation or doubt that altered outcomes permanently. Elsewhere within mythic tradition, transformation operated as both preservation and boundary. Figures who crossed certain limits, whether through curiosity, pride, or desperation, were sometimes changed into animals, plants, or landscape features. These changes allowed their stories to remain physically embedded within the environment. A rock formation might be explained as the resting place of someone who had challenged divine authority. A grove of unusual trees might carry the memory of individuals granted protection through metamorphosis. Such narratives encouraged attentiveness to surroundings. Travelers encountering unfamiliar terrain were less likely to treat it as empty. Each hill or stream possessed potential significance. This interpretive habit fostered a relationship with landscape that combined practical navigation with imaginative respect. Even if belief varied from person to person, the shared language of myth provided a framework for describing place. Craftsmanship held its own sacred associations. Workshops filled with the steady rhythm of hammer against metal or chisel against stone were considered spaces where human skill approached divine creativity. Hephaestus, often depicted as patient and methodical, represented the idea that excellence emerged through sustained effort rather than sudden inspiration. Artisans who produced finely balanced tools or intricately decorated vessels could view their work as participation in a tradition that linked manual labor with higher purpose. Weaving, in particular, occupied a central symbolic role across multiple myths. The interlacing of threads into durable fabric mirrored the formation of social bonds within communities. Stories involving contests of weaving emphasized not only technical proficiency, but also humility in the face of inherited knowledge. Patterns created on looms frequently incorporated familiar mythic scenes, turning everyday objects into carriers of narrative memory. Music likewise served as both entertainment and preservation. The repetition of melodic structures made long sequences of verse easier to retain. Performers who traveled between settlements carried variations of the same stories, adjusting details to suit local audiences while maintaining recognizable cores. This fluid transmission prevented mythology from becoming static. Instead, it evolved gradually, absorbing regional preferences without losing coherence. Public gatherings provided opportunities for collective engagement with mythic themes. Athletic competitions, dramatic performances, and processions were not isolated spectacles, but components of festivals that reinforced shared identity. Participants experienced mythology not only as listeners, but as active contributors to its continuation. A chorus reciting lines from a well-known narrative did more than entertain, it reaffirmed communal memory. Within theatrical contexts, characters drawn from myth allowed exploration of ethical dilemmas without directly implicating contemporary individuals. Audiences observed decisions made by figures whose outcomes were already known, focusing attention on motivations and consequences rather than suspense. The pacing of such performances often allowed space for reflection between moments of tension, aligning with the broader narrative style that favored gradual development over abrupt resolution.
Heroic figures, while celebrated, were rarely portrayed as flawless. Their stories included misjudgments, fatigue, and moments of vulnerability. This complexity made their experiences relatable rather than purely aspirational. The labors of Heracles, for instance, required persistence across diverse challenges that tested endurance more than sheer strength. Each completed task represented incremental progress toward restoration rather than immediate triumph. Other heroes relied less on physical capability and more on strategic thinking. Individuals navigating unfamiliar territories or negotiating with unpredictable rulers reflected the realities faced by traders and diplomats. Their successes often depended on careful observation, patience, and the willingness to adapt plans when circumstances shifted. These narratives reinforced the value of flexibility within environments that rarely remained stable. The presence of divine intervention within heroic tales did not eliminate human responsibility. Assistance from gods typically required initiative from the mortal involved. A gift of equipment or a piece of advice created opportunity, but the outcome still depended on action. This balance preserved agency while acknowledging forces beyond direct control. As centuries progressed, written versions of myths began to circulate more widely. The transition from exclusively oral tradition to recorded text introduced a degree of standardization, yet variation persisted. Different authors emphasized distinct aspects of the same events, shaping tone and interpretation. This multiplicity allowed mythology to function simultaneously as literature, cultural memory, and philosophical resource. Philosophical schools engaged with myth in diverse ways. Some thinkers treated narratives as symbolic expressions of natural processes, suggesting that divine conflicts represented elemental interactions. Others considered myths educational tools that conveyed ethical principles through memorable imagery. Even when literal belief diminished in certain circles, the stories retained value as frameworks for discussing human behavior. Artistic representation continued to reinforce mythic presence within daily life. Painted ceramics used during meals frequently depicted recognizable scenes. The act of drinking from a vessel decorated with a familiar narrative created a subtle connection between routine activity and shared heritage. Sculptures placed in public spaces provided visual reference points that required no spoken explanation. Trade and migration extended these visual and narrative traditions beyond the Greek mainland. Colonies established along distant coasts integrated local influences, creating hybrid forms of worship and storytelling. A deity associated primarily with agriculture in one region might acquire maritime attributes elsewhere. This adaptability prevented mythology from becoming confined to a single cultural context. Over time, the integration of Greek and Roman traditions produced a layered pantheon in which names changed but essential characteristics endured. The persistence of underlying themes, balance between order and chaos, respect for cyclical change, acknowledgement of limits, demonstrated that mythology functioned less as rigid doctrine and more as a flexible interpretive system.
Even in later periods, when new religious frameworks gained prominence, mythological references remained embedded within language and education. Poetic metaphors drawn from earlier narratives continued to appear in literature, preserving continuity across intellectual traditions. The endurance of these references suggests that mythology had become part of the cultural foundation rather than an isolated belief system. Returning imaginatively to a quiet evening in ancient Greece, one might picture a household gradually settling after the day's labor. The final tasks, banking the fire, securing animals, arranging tools, were completed with practiced efficiency. Conversation shifted from practical matters to recollection. A story might begin without formal announcement, introduced by a simple remark linking present circumstances to remembered narrative. As the tale unfolded, listeners did not require dramatic emphasis to remain engaged. Familiarity provided comfort. The steady pace allowed attention to drift without losing orientation. Details of landscape, lineage, and transformation accumulated gradually, creating a sense of continuity rather than urgency. The storyteller's voice, shaped by repetition across years, carried rhythms that encouraged relaxation. Outside, the sky darkened fully. Constellations emerged one by one, each associated with figures whose stories had been heard countless times. The boundary between narration and observation blurred. Looking upward became an extension of listening. The environment itself participated in the preservation of myth. In this atmosphere, Greek mythology functioned not as distant entertainment, but as an enduring companion to daily existence. Its narratives explained cycles that continued regardless of political change or generational turnover. The gods did not need to appear visibly to remain present within thought. Their stories provided a framework through which uncertainty could be approached with a measure of calm acceptance.
Aeolus's role within myth was neither tyrannical nor benevolent in a simplistic sense. He governed movement that could be helpful or destructive depending on circumstance. Sailors hoped for favorable winds, but feared sudden storms that could push them off course. The image of winds contained within a bag, released intentionally or accidentally, reflected how fragile control over nature could be. A journey could be planned carefully, yet a single shift in direction might undo days of progress. Further inland, where hills broke the horizon into uneven silhouettes, echoes carried sound in unusual ways. A voice calling across a valley might return moments later, distorted but recognizable. Such phenomena encouraged the emergence of figures like Echo, whose myth explained repetition not as a physical property of terrain, but as the lingering presence of a nymph unable to speak independently. Her story added emotional depth to what would otherwise be dismissed as an acoustic effect. Listeners did not need technical explanation. The narrative itself provided a gentle framework for understanding. Mythological explanations were rarely presented as rigid doctrine. Instead, multiple versions of the same story circulated simultaneously. One household might emphasize a different detail than another, and these variations were not treated as errors. The flexibility allowed mythology to remain relevant across regions with distinct landscapes. A mountainous community might focus more heavily on deities associated with heights and storms, while a fertile plain emphasized agricultural figures whose influence appeared in the condition of soil. In many villages, shrines were modest structures, sometimes nothing more than a marked stone or a small platform where offerings could be placed. Their significance did not depend on elaborate construction. A simple space designated for acknowledgement created a focal point where individuals could pause during routine travel. Passing such a place, someone might leave a fragment of bread or a few drops of oil without interrupting the day's schedule. These gestures were integrated into movement rather than requiring formal ceremony. The Greek pantheon, though often depicted collectively, functioned more like an extended network than a unified hierarchy. Relationships between deities shifted depending on the context of each narrative. Zeus maintained authority as a figure associated with the sky and overarching order, yet his influence did not eliminate the autonomy of others. Each domain, sea, harvest, craftsmanship, wilderness, retained its own rhythms. This distributed structure mirrored the decentralized political landscape of Greek city-states, where independence coexisted with shared cultural identity. Hera's presence within mythology illustrates how divine roles could encompass both dignity and complexity. As protector of marriage, she symbolized continuity within family structures, yet many narratives also describe her responding intensely to perceived betrayal. These stories were not merely cautionary tales, but reflections of tensions that existed within human relationships. By projecting such emotions onto a divine figure, mythology allowed listeners to explore conflict without directly implicating individuals within their community.